My name is Amber Mitchell, 29 years old, and I never imagined I'd find my parents locked outside in the freezing cold, blue-lipped and shivering, while my in-laws partied inside our home. The image of my mom and dad huddled together, pounding desperately on our door as Barbara, my mother-in-law, deliberately ignored them, is burned into my memory forever. That night changed everything about our family dynamics, and trust me when I say, the consequences I delivered were just as cold as what they endured. Before I dive into this shocking family drama, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like and subscribe button, and get ready for a story about standing up for the people you love. My husband Ryan and I had been married for 3 years when this incident happened. We met in college, he was studying business, and I was pursuing journalism. It wasn't exactly love at first sight, but a slow-building connection that deepened over our senior year. Ryan was intelligent, ambitious, and had a kindness that drew me to him despite our different backgrounds. My parents, Kathleen and Michael Turner, are the salt of the earth. Dad worked as a high school math teacher for 30 years, and Mom ran a small bookstore in our hometown. They raised me in a modest 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood, where family dinners were sacred and holidays were filled with homemade decorations and traditions. They supported me through every stage of my life, staying up late to help with school projects, driving me to countless extracurricular activities, and later, helping me pay for college with their modest savings. When I introduced Ryan to them, they welcomed him immediately, no questions asked, simply because he made me happy. Ryan's parents, Barbara and Richard Wilson, were a different story entirely. They lived in an exclusive gated community, with Richard having built a successful real estate development company from the ground up. Barbara had never worked outside the home, instead devoting herself to maintaining their social status through charity galas, country club memberships, and cultivating the right friendships. From the first time I met them, I sensed their reservations about me. Barbara's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me, and Richard's questions about my family always seemed designed to highlight our class differences. Journalism, how interesting, Barbara had said when Ryan first told them about my career choice. I suppose there's always a need for people to report on things. The slight emphasis on report made it clear she considered it beneath their family's standards. The class divide became more apparent as our relationship progressed. When Ryan proposed, Barbara immediately suggested venues that cost more than my parents' annual income. When I opted for something more modest, she told relatives it was charming that we were keeping things simple. At our wedding, she referred to my parents' friends as Kathleen and Michael's acquaintances when introducing them to her social circle. For 3 years, I watched these subtle digs and microaggressions, always hoping that time would smooth the rough edges between our families. Ryan would notice occasionally and speak to his parents, but he'd grown up navigating Barbara's controlling nature and Richard's dismissive attitude. He'd developed a coping mechanism of avoiding confrontation, assuring me that they're just set in their ways or they don't mean anything by it. I wanted to believe him, especially after we purchased our first home, a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a neighborhood that straddled the line between up-and-coming and established. It wasn't in the prestigious area where the Wilsons lived, but it was nothing to scoff at either. We were proud of it, having saved for the down payment ourselves despite Richard's repeated offers to help the kids out. Around this time, my career took an unexpected upswing. After years of working my way up at a local news station, I landed a position as a featured investigative reporter for a major network affiliate. Suddenly, I was appearing on television regularly, conducting hard-hitting interviews, and even winning a regional journalism award for a series on political corruption. My success seemed to trigger something in Barbara. Her comments became more pointed, her behaviors more overtly dismissive of my achievements. At a dinner celebrating my new position, she spent most of the evening talking about Ryan's cousin who worked as a producer for a national news show, subtly implying that my local success paled in comparison. When my parents proudly mentioned watching my segments, Barbara changed the subject to the charity auction she was organizing. As the holiday season approached, Ryan and I decided to host Christmas at our new home. It would be the first major family gathering in our house, and I was determined to make it special. Little did I know that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would forever change my relationship with the Wilsons. Planning our first holiday gathering felt like a milestone in our marriage. Ryan and I spent evenings discussing how to blend traditions from both our families, creating something that would honor our past while establishing our own customs. I wanted the warm, inclusive feeling of my childhood Christmases, with homemade ornaments and silly gift exchanges, while incorporating some of the elegance that Ryan had grown up with. "This is going to be amazing," I told Ryan one night as we sat at our kitchen table, making lists of decorations and potential menu items. "I want everyone to feel welcome and comfortable." "It will be," Ryan assured me, squeezing my hand. "Both our families together in our new home, it's exactly what the holidays should be about." We decided on a guest list of about 20 people, our immediate families, a few close cousins, and some friends who didn't have local family. The menu would be a blend of traditional dishes: my mom's famous apple pie alongside Barbara's elegant chocolate truffle cake, my dad's special eggnog recipe, and Richard's top-shelf whiskey collection. I spent hours designing beautiful invitations, carefully wording them to make it clear that we were the hosts while still honoring both sets of parents. When I called my parents to tell them about our plans, they were thrilled. "Oh honey, that's wonderful," Mom exclaimed. "What can we bring?" "I'll make the apple pie, of course, and maybe those cranberry muffins everyone loves for breakfast." "We'd also like to come early to help set up," Dad added. "No sense in you two doing all the work yourselves." Their enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself even more excited about the upcoming celebration. They didn't have much money for gifts, but they always gave generously of their time and support. Barbara's reaction was predictably different when Ryan called his parents. "Christmas at your house," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the speaker. "But we always host at our home. The club caterers are already booked for our usual spread." Ryan patiently explained that we wanted to start our own tradition in our new home. After several minutes of back and forth, Barbara reluctantly agreed, though not without adding, "Well, I suppose we can make it work this once. But I'll need to bring my china and crystal. I can't imagine you have service for 20. What followed was a slow, methodical takeover of my carefully laid plans. Barbara called daily with suggestions that were really directives. She sent links to specific decorations we simply must have and forwarded the contact information for her preferred caterer when I mentioned cooking much of the food ourselves. "Amber, darling," she said during one particularly frustrating call, "hosting isn't just about having space. It's about creating an experience. Let me handle the details so you don't have to worry your pretty little head." Each time, I would politely but firmly reclaim some aspect of the planning, only to have Barbara circle back days later as if our conversation had never happened. Ryan tried to mediate, but his peacemaking usually involved compromises that felt like surrenders. "Maybe we should let Mom bring her caterer for the appetizers," he suggested after one tense phone call. "It would take some pressure off you." "This isn't about pressure, Ryan," I explained, trying to keep frustration from my voice. "It's about us hosting our own holiday in our own way. Your mother is treating me like I'm incapable." The invitations went out 3 weeks before Christmas, clearly stating that dinner would begin at 5 p.m., with guests welcome to arrive anytime after 3 p.m. for pre-dinner drinks and socializing. My parents called immediately to confirm they'd be there around 1 p.m. to help with preparations, which I gratefully accepted. Barbara, however, called with concerns about the timing. 3 o'clock is awfully late to start, Amber. The Hendersons always begin their Christmas gathering at noon. We thought people might have morning commitments or other family to visit earlier in the day, I explained. "Well, Richard and I will come at 2, she declared. "We'll help you get everything properly arranged before the other guests arrive." Before I could object, she had moved on to questioning my choice of menu items and suggesting replacements. By the time the call ended, I had a pounding headache and a sense of dread about the upcoming holiday. As Christmas drew closer, the interference intensified. Barbara sent expensive decorations to our house without asking, including a centerpiece that clashed with everything I'd planned. Richard called Ryan several times to discuss the inadequate wine selection, eventually showing up unannounced with cases of his preferred vintages. Through it all, my parents remained supportive, offering help without trying to take over. Mom called with gentle reminders about family members' food allergies and preferences, while Dad offered to pick up any last-minute items we might need. Their understanding of boundaries only highlighted how differently the Wilsons operated. The day before Christmas, my anxiety reached a peak when Barbara texted to say she'd taken the liberty of hiring servers for the event as a gift. "I don't want servers in our home," I told Ryan firmly. "This is a family gathering, not a society event." Ryan called his mother and declined the offer, leading to a tense conversation that ended with Barbara saying she was only trying to help and that we would learn the hard way about proper hosting. That night, as Ryan and I finished setting the table and arranging the last of the decorations, I voiced my concerns one final time. "I'm worried about tomorrow," I admitted. "Your mother seems determined to take over." "It'll be fine," Ryan said, pulling me into a hug. "Once everyone's here and having a good time, all this tension will fade away. You'll see." If only I had known how wrong he would be. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold, with a light dusting of snow that made everything look like a holiday card. Ryan and I woke early, exchanged our personal gifts to each other, and began the final preparations. The house smelled amazing: cinnamon, pine, and the aroma of the turkey I'd put in the oven at dawn. My parents arrived promptly at 1 p.m., arms loaded with carefully wrapped presents and homemade food contributions. Mom looked festive in a red sweater with tiny embroidered snowflakes, and Dad wore the reindeer tie I'd given him years ago that had become his holiday tradition. "The house looks beautiful, sweetheart," Mom said, hugging me tight. "You've done an amazing job." Dad whistled appreciatively as he took in our decorations. "This puts our little tree to shame. But it feels like home. You've got your mother's touch." They immediately rolled up their sleeves and got to work. Dad helped Ryan move furniture to create better flow for the party, while Mom and I worked side by side in the kitchen, putting final touches on appetizers and side dishes. There was an easy rhythm to our collaboration, with Mom following my lead and offering suggestions only when asked. "I'm so proud of you," she said quietly as we arranged a platter of deviled eggs. "Building your career, making this beautiful home with Ryan. You've grown into such a capable woman." The warm moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Ryan checked his watch with a frown. "It's only 2:15. That can't be guests already." But of course, it was Barbara and Richard, arriving 45 minutes earlier than even their self-adjusted time. Barbara swept in wearing an obviously expensive red silk dress and heels that would be impractical for a relaxed family gathering. Richard followed with boxes of wine and whiskey, barely acknowledging my parents. "Merry Christmas," Barbara announced, air-kissing my cheeks before I could even offer a proper greeting. She handed her coat to Ryan rather than using the coat rack clearly visible in the entryway. "We decided to come a bit earlier. There's always so much to do before guests arrive." She looked around critically, her gaze lingering on the handmade wreath my mother had brought. "How rustic. But I'd brought a few things to elevate the decor." She signaled to Richard, who returned to their car and brought in several shopping bags filled with expensive decorations and serving pieces. "We already finished decorating," I said firmly. "But thank you for the thought." Barbara smiled tightly. "Oh, these aren't additional decorations, dear. They're replacements for some of the more homespun elements. Trust me, the Pattersons are very particular about aesthetics, and they'll notice everything." Before I could respond, she had moved into the kitchen, where she immediately began rearranging the appetizers my mother and I had just finished preparing. "Kathleen," she acknowledged my mother with a brief nod. "How nice of you to help. But we should present these differently. In my experience, guests respond better to a more elegant arrangement." My mother stepped back, hurt flashing across her face before she composed herself. "Amber has everything under control, Barbara. I'm just following her instructions." "Yes, well," Barbara replied, already dismantling our careful work, "there's following instructions and then there's elevating the experience." In the living room, Richard had cornered Ryan and my father with complaints about our neighborhood. "The property values here are stagnant at best," he was saying as I walked in. You really should have consulted me before purchasing in this area. There's a development going up near the lake that would have been much more suitable. My father, always diplomatic, tried to change the subject. Ryan and Amber found a beautiful home that works for them. And they did their research. Amber showed me the market trends for this neighborhood. Richard waved this away. No offense, Michael, but real estate is my business. The trends that matter aren't visible to the average consumer. The next hour passed in a similar fashion, with Barbara criticizing and rearranging everything from the table settings to the music playlist, while Richard dominated conversations with his opinions on everything from politics to wine vintages. My parents gradually retreated to less visible roles, with Dad quietly fixing the wobbly leg on a side table and Mom slipping out to buy more ice when our supply ran low. By the time other guests began arriving at 3 p.m., Barbara had firmly established herself as the de facto hostess. She positioned herself near the door, greeting people as they entered and directing them through our home as if she owned it. I found myself constantly interrupted when trying to welcome friends and family, with Barbara stepping in to take control of conversations. Have you met my son's wife? She would say, placing subtle emphasis on my relationship to Ryan rather than my name. She and Ryan have this charming little house now. My mother-in-law stationed herself in the kitchen, supervising the food placement and taking credit for dishes my mother and I had prepared. When guests complimented the cranberry sauce, I overheard her saying, "Thank you, it's a family recipe I taught Amber." Ryan seemed oblivious to most of the tension, busy playing bartender and catching up with relatives. When I managed to pull him aside to point out his mother's behavior, he just shrugged. That's just how she is at parties. She likes to feel important. She's making my parents uncomfortable in our home, I insisted. They seem fine, he said, glancing at my father who was quietly helping an elderly aunt into a comfortable chair. Everyone's having a good time. Let's not make an issue of little things. But they weren't little things, and as the afternoon wore on, the divide between our families became increasingly apparent. Barbara had gathered the important guests in the living room, while my parents and their friends had been effectively relegated to the den and kitchen. The separation wasn't explicit, but it was deliberate, achieved through Barbara's subtle steering of conversations and strategic introductions. By 4:30 p.m., most of the guests had arrived, and the house was filled with conversation and laughter. On the surface, the party appeared to be a success. But beneath the festive atmosphere, I could feel the undercurrents of tension and the way my parents were being systematically sidelined in our own home. I was just about to start organizing dinner service when I overheard Barbara speaking to my mother in the hallway. "Kathleen, we seem to be running low on wine. Would you and Michael mind running out to pick up a few more bottles?" Richard wrote down exactly what we need. My mother, ever helpful, readily agreed. Of course. Let me just get Michael and our coats. I stepped forward to intervene. Mom, you don't need to do that. We have plenty of wine. Barbara turned to me with a practiced smile. Better to have too much than too little, don't you think? And your parents offered to help. Before I could object further, Richard appeared with a list and some cash. Here you go, Michael. The liquor store on Maple should have everything. Get the 2018 vintage if they have it, not the 2019. My parents, not wanting to create a scene, accepted the list and money. We'll be back soon, my father assured everyone, helping my mother into her coat. Not the heavy winter coat she'd arrived in, I noticed, but a lighter jacket that had been hanging on our coat rack. As they left, Barbara immediately returned to holding court in the living room, and the party continued. I was pulled into conversations and hosting duties, but kept glancing at the clock, expecting my parents to return within 20 minutes or so. I had no idea that Barbara had just set in motion a cruel deception that would change everything. The next 45 minutes passed in a blur of hosting duties. I served appetizers, refreshed drinks, and made introductions between guests who hadn't yet met. All the while, a nagging worry about my parents grew in the back of my mind. The liquor store was only 10 minutes away, they should have returned by now. At one point, I caught Ryan's eye across the room and motioned him over. "Have you heard from my parents? They've been gone almost an hour." Ryan checked his phone and shook his head. "No messages." "Maybe the store was crowded? It is Christmas Day, after all." "Maybe," I said, unconvinced. "I'm going to call them." I stepped into the quiet of our bedroom and dialed my mom's number. It went straight to voicemail. My dad's phone did the same. The uneasiness in my stomach intensified. When I returned to the party, I approached Barbara, who was regaling Ryan's cousins with stories about her recent Mediterranean cruise. "Barbara, did my parents call you? They've been gone a long time, and neither of them is answering their phones." She barely paused her story. "Oh, I'm sure they're fine. They probably stopped somewhere else." You know how easily distracted people can be. Something in her dismissive tone triggered my suspicions. I excused myself and walked to the front window, looking out at the street. No sign of my parents' car. I checked the driveway and the garage, nothing. On impulse, I walked to the back of the house and looked out the kitchen window toward our backyard patio. What I saw there froze the blood in my veins. My parents were huddled together outside the back door, pounding on it with increasing desperation. Even from a distance, I could see their lips had turned blue with cold, and they were shivering violently in their inadequate clothing. Snow had begun falling again, dusting their hair and shoulders with white. I raced to the door and flung it open. "Mom. Dad. What happened?" They stumbled inside, their faces pale and drawn with cold. My father's hands were red and raw from knocking. The door was locked, my mother stammered through chattering teeth. "We've been out there for almost an hour." We kept ringing the bell and knocking, but no one came. "We thought maybe no one could hear us over the music," my father added, his voice hoarse. "But we could see people inside, walking past the windows." I helped them to the kitchen, turning on the kettle for tea and wrapping my mother in the throw blanket from the nearby couch. "Why didn't you call me?" "Our phones are in our coats," my mother explained, still shivering. "In the front closet." Rage built inside me as I realized what must have happened. I turned to find Ryan standing in the kitchen doorway, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as he took in the scene. "What happened?" he asked. "Someone locked my parents outside," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "They've been out there for an hour in the freezing cold." As if summoned by our conversation, Barbara appeared behind Ryan. She took in the scene with a flicker of surprise that quickly transformed into practiced concern. "Oh my goodness, what happened to you two?" she asked my parents, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. Before they could answer, I stepped forward. "They were locked outside, Barbara. Someone locked the back door after they left to get wine." "Well, I certainly didn't hear the doorbell," she said defensively. "The music must have been too loud." Just then, Melissa, Ryan's 16-year-old cousin, entered the kitchen looking for a soda. She stopped short when she saw us all. "Oh, are your parents okay?" she asked me with genuine concern. I told Aunt Barbara they were knocking like 20 minutes ago, but she said they probably just stepped out for a smoke or something and to leave the door locked because of the cold. The kitchen fell silent. My mother gasped softly. Ryan stared at his mother in disbelief. Barbara's face flushed red. I thought they were just getting some air. I didn't realize Save it," I cut her off coldly. "You knew exactly what you were doing." As I turned back to tend to my parents, I overheard Barbara whisper to another guest passing by the kitchen, "Kathleen and Michael are making such a fuss." It was just a misunderstanding. Some people simply aren't equipped to handle minor inconveniences. Something inside me snapped. All the months of subtle insults, the dismissive treatment, the calculated attempts to make my parents feel inferior, it all crystallized in that moment into perfect clarity. This hadn't been a misunderstanding or an oversight. It had been deliberate cruelty. I looked at Ryan, waiting for him to say something, to stand up to his mother. He stood frozen, conflict written across his face. Ryan?" I prompted, my voice hard with expectation. He swallowed visibly, looking between his mother and me. "Mom," he finally said, his voice quieter than I'd hoped, "if you knew they were outside, why didn't you let them in?" Barbara waved a dismissive hand. "Don't be ridiculous, Ryan. If I'd known Kathleen and Michael were actually stuck, of course I would have opened the door. This is all just a silly misunderstanding being blown out of proportion." "Melissa just said she told you they were knocking," Ryan pointed out, his spine straightening slightly as he found his courage. "The girl misheard me," Barbara insisted. "Now, let's not ruin the party with this drama. Your wife's parents are fine, just a little cold. They'll warm up and everything will be fine." I could feel rage building inside me, threatening to explode. But I looked at my parents, now sipping tea, still shivering, trying not to cause a scene despite their ordeal, and I knew this moment required strategic thinking rather than an emotional outburst. "This party is already ruined," I said quietly, my voice carrying in the now silent kitchen where several guests had gathered, drawn by the tension. "But the evening isn't over yet." As my parents warmed themselves with hot tea, I made a quick decision. I turned to the small crowd that had gathered in and near our kitchen. "Everyone, I need to address something that's happened," I announced, my voice steady despite my inner turmoil. My parents were intentionally locked outside in freezing temperatures for nearly an hour while we all celebrated inside. Gasps and murmurs spread through the group. Barbara stepped forward, her face a mask of indignation. "Amber, this is hardly appropriate conversation for a Christmas gathering. Your parents had a minor inconvenience, that's all." "A minor inconvenience?" I repeated incredulously. "They could have developed hypothermia. Look at them." All eyes turned to my parents. My mother's lips still had a bluish tinge, and my father's hands trembled as he held his mug. The evidence was undeniable. "I think," I continued, raising my voice slightly to be heard throughout the house, "that everyone should know exactly what kind of people they're celebrating with today." Ryan moved to my side, finally finding his backbone. "Mom, what happened was unacceptable. You knew they were out there." Barbara's practiced social mask began to slip. "You're taking her side? After everything your father and I have done for you?" "This isn't about sides," Ryan responded. "It's about basic human decency." More guests had gathered now, forming a semicircle around our unfolding family drama. I could see the discomfort on many faces, but also the curiosity, the unavoidable fascination with watching a perfect holiday facade crumble. Richard pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with either alcohol or anger. "What's all this commotion? Barbara, what's happening?" "Your wife locked my parents outside in 20-degree weather and ignored their knocks for almost an hour," I informed him coldly. "Even after being told they were out there." Richard looked momentarily stunned, then quickly recovered. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Barbara wouldn't do something like that." "I heard her," Melissa piped up, her young voice clear in the tense silence. "I told Aunt Barbara they were knocking, and she said to leave them out there." Richard's expression hardened. The girl's confused. "This is absurd. Come on, Barbara, we don't have to stand here and be accused like this." "Actually, you do," Ryan said, his voice stronger now. "In our home, you do have to answer for this." Barbara's composure finally shattered. "Fine. So I didn't rush to let them in right away. They were perfectly safe, just a little cold. They're making a mountain out of a molehill, which is exactly what I'd expect from people of their background." The naked contempt in her voice shocked even those who had been sympathetic to her. I heard several guests inhale sharply. "Our background," my father spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. "You mean middle-class, hard-working people who raised their daughter to respect others regardless of their wealth or status?" "I mean people who don't understand the social graces required in certain circles," Barbara snapped. "People who embarrass my son at every gathering with their quaint little stories and homemade dishes." "That's enough, Mother," Ryan said sharply. "You're talking about my wife's parents. About family. They're not our kind of family, Richard interjected, placing a hand on Barbara's shoulder. We've tolerated this merger of backgrounds for your sake, but there are limits to what we should have to endure. My mother stood up then, her small frame dignified despite her ordeal. We have never been anything but kind to both of you. We welcomed Ryan into our family without question because he makes our daughter happy. That's all that has ever mattered to us. How touching, Barbara sneered. But let's be honest, you benefited far more from this relationship than we have. Your daughter married up, and you've been riding her coattails into social circles you could never access otherwise. The room fell completely silent. Even Richard seemed shocked by Barbara's explicit articulation of what had previously been merely implied prejudice. Get out of our house, I said, my voice deadly quiet. Both of you. Now. Amber, Richard began in a patronizing tone, you're upset, but let's not. I said get out. My voice rose to a shout. You are no longer welcome in our home. Not today, not ever, unless you can sincerely apologize and prove that you've changed. Ryan stepped forward. She's right. You need to leave, Dad. Take Mom and go. Richard's face darkened with anger. You're choosing them over your own parents? After everything we've given you? The connections, the opportunities, the financial support? I never asked for any of that, Ryan replied steadily. And if it comes with the expectation that I'll stand by while you abuse the people I love, then I don't want it. You'll regret this, Richard threatened. There will be consequences, financially and otherwise. Are you threatening to cut me off? Ryan laughed without humor. Go ahead. I have a good job, a home we paid for ourselves, and a wife with a successful career. We don't need your money. Several guests had begun quietly gathering their coats, sensing that the party was effectively over. Others lingered, unsure of protocol in such an unprecedented situation. My parents, ever conscious of others' comfort, started to look concerned about the impact on our guests. Please, everyone, my mother began, don't let this spoil your Christmas. No, Mom, I interrupted gently. This needed to happen. I'm sorry it ruined the party, but I'm not sorry for standing up for you and Dad. Barbara and Richard, realizing they had lost all sympathy in the room, finally began moving toward the door. Barbara paused for one final barb. Ryan, when you come to your senses and realize what a mistake you've made, your father and I will be waiting. But I warn you, there will need to be serious changes in this relationship dynamic. The only change, Ryan replied, will be in how you treat my wife and her family. Until you can respect them, we have nothing to discuss. As they left, slamming the door behind them, the remaining guests stood in awkward silence. Then, to my surprise, Ryan's sister Jessica stepped forward. I'm so sorry about what happened, she said, addressing my parents directly. For what it's worth, not all of us think like them. I've always enjoyed your company and your stories. She turned to me. And Amber, thank you for having the courage to stand up to them. Someone needed to, a long time ago. Her words broke the tension. Other relatives and friends came forward with similar sentiments, many admitting they had witnessed Barbara's behavior over the years but had been unwilling to challenge the family matriarch. Within half an hour, most guests had departed with sincere apologies and concerned well wishes. Only a few close friends and Ryan's siblings remained, helping us clean up and process what had happened. As the adrenaline of confrontation faded, I felt both drained and resolute. Looking at my parents, now recovered from their physical ordeal but clearly shaken by the evening's events, I knew this wasn't over. Barbara and Richard had shown their true colors in front of witnesses, but people like them rarely accepted defeat gracefully. They would try to rewrite this narrative, to paint themselves as victims of an ungrateful son and his unreasonable wife. They would attempt to salvage their social standing and punish us for our defiance. But as I met Ryan's eyes across the room and saw the newfound determination there, I knew we would face whatever came next together. The time for tolerating disrespect was over. The days following Christmas were a strange mixture of peace and tension. With the Wilsons out of our immediate orbit, there was a palpable sense of relief in our home. Ryan and I spent time with my parents, making sure they were truly okay after their ordeal. Physically, they recovered quickly, but I could tell the emotional impact ran deeper. "I just don't understand why she hates us so much," my mother said one evening as we sat in our living room, the Christmas tree lights twinkling in the background. "We've never done anything to hurt her." "It's not about anything you did, Mom," I explained gently. "It's about her own insecurities and prejudices. She sees the world in terms of social hierarchies, and anyone she perceives as beneath her threatens her sense of status." My father, always the more philosophical of my parents, nodded thoughtfully. "People who need to put others down to feel important are fighting their own demons. Still doesn't make it right, what she did." Ryan had been unusually quiet since the confrontation, processing his own complicated feelings about his parents. That night, after my parents had gone home, we had our first real heart-to-heart about what had happened and what it meant for our future. "I knew my mother could be difficult," he admitted as we sat on our couch, the house eerily quiet after days of holiday chaos. "But I never thought she could be so deliberately cruel. I keep replaying all the times I dismissed your concerns about how she treated you and your family, telling myself she didn't mean any harm." "You were raised to normalize her behavior," I said, taking his hand. "It's hard to see clearly when it's all you've known." "That's no excuse," he said firmly. "I should have stood up to her years ago. I was so afraid of rocking the boat that I let her mistreat the people I love most." "I'm sorry, Amber." His sincere remorse touched me deeply. "What matters is that you stood with me when it counted." "But Ryan, this isn't over. Your parents won't just accept what happened and move on." As if on cue, his phone lit up with a call from his mother. It was her fifth attempt that day. All the previous calls had gone to voicemail, along with a dozen text messages ranging from defensive, "You completely misunderstood what happened," to manipulative, "Your father's blood pressure is dangerously high from this stress." Ryan silenced the phone without answering. "I know they won't let this go. But I meant what I said. I won't have a relationship with them unless they sincerely apologize and change their behavior." The next morning brought the first salvo in what would become Barbara's campaign to reclaim control of the narrative. Several mutual friends called to say they'd heard Barbara's side of the story, a heavily revised version where my parents had rudely insisted on getting more alcohol despite abundant supply, then dramatically overreacted to being briefly delayed at the door. "She's telling everyone it was just a misunderstanding," our friend Megan reported after receiving a lengthy call from Barbara. "She's positioning herself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter-in-law with a chip on her shoulder." More concerning were the calls Ryan received from his father's business associates, subtly inquiring about family troubles and hinting at potential professional consequences. Richard had begun leveraging his connections to apply pressure. "He's trying to threaten my career," Ryan realized after the third such call. "He thinks if he makes things uncomfortable enough at work, I'll fall in line to protect my job." The turning point came 3 days after Christmas, when Ryan's younger sister Madison visited us. Unlike Jessica, who had stood with us at the party, Madison had always been more susceptible to Barbara's influence. "Mom and Dad are really upset," she began awkwardly after accepting a cup of coffee. "They feel like you humiliated them in front of everyone." "They humiliated themselves," Ryan replied evenly. "No one made Mom lock Amber's parents outside or say those horrible things." Madison shifted uncomfortably. "I know, but couldn't you just apologize to smooth things over? You know how Mom is about maintaining appearances. This whole situation is making things difficult for everyone. So we should just pretend nothing happened?" I asked incredulously. My parents could have been seriously hurt. "I'm not saying what happened was okay," Madison clarified hastily. "It's just Mom's telling everyone who'll listen about how ungrateful and dramatic you both are. She's even talking about skipping Jessica's wedding if you're there." This new information hit hard. Jessica was getting married in the spring, and the last thing we wanted was to cause problems for her. "She's really going that far?" Ryan asked, his voice tight with anger. Madison nodded miserably. "She's on a warpath. And Dad's calling in favors to make life difficult for you professionally. She hesitated, then added, they're also telling people that Amber's news reporting is biased and unprofessional, reaching out to contacts at her network. I felt my stomach drop. They were attacking my professional reputation, something I'd worked incredibly hard to build. This wasn't just family drama anymore, they were actively trying to harm our livelihoods and relationships. After Madison left, Ryan and I sat in stunned silence for several minutes. They're not going to stop, I finally said. They'll keep escalating until they either force us back in line or destroy our relationships with everyone else. Ryan nodded grimly. We need a plan. Not just to defend ourselves, but to make it clear that their behavior has consequences. That night, we began developing our strategy. If Barbara and Richard wanted to play hardball, they'd find we were more than capable of responding in kind, but unlike them, we'd be operating from a position of truth and principle. First, I reached out to Jessica to assure her that we would never put her in the position of choosing between family members at her wedding. Her response was immediate and supportive, don't you dare step back because of Mom's threats. This is exactly how she's controlled the family for years. It stops now. Next, Ryan documented the calls he'd received from his father's business associates, carefully noting any implied threats or inappropriate pressure. He scheduled a meeting with his company's HR department to proactively address any potential interference in his professional standing. For my part, I used my investigative journalism skills to compile a comprehensive record of Barbara and Richard's behavior, not just the Christmas incident, but years of manipulative and demeaning actions. I collected statements from witnesses to the Christmas confrontation, ensuring we had corroboration for our account of events. While gathering this information, I discovered something interesting. Barbara and Richard's social standing wasn't as secure as they pretended. Behind their backs, many in their circle found them overbearing and unpleasant but tolerated them due to Richard's business connections and Barbara's aggressive social climbing. Most enlightening was a conversation with Eleanor Patterson, one of the influential society women Barbara desperately tried to impress. After hearing our story, Eleanor confided, Barbara has always been insecure about her background. Did you know her father was a factory worker? She reinvented herself when she married Richard and has been terrified of anyone discovering her common roots ever since. This revelation explained so much about Barbara's treatment of my parents. She wasn't looking down on them from a position of lifelong privilege, she was desperately distancing herself from her own origins. Armed with this knowledge and our growing documentation, Ryan and I finalized our approach. We wouldn't stoop to their level of spreading rumors or making threats. Instead, we would stand firmly in the truth, set clear boundaries, and be prepared to enforce consequences if those boundaries were violated. Ryan drafted a carefully worded email to his parents, copying his siblings. Mom and Dad. What happened at Christmas was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of cruelty toward Amber's parents, followed by explicit expressions of classist prejudice that shocked everyone present. We are aware that you've been contacting our friends, colleagues, and extended family to spread a false narrative about what occurred. We're also aware of attempts to interfere with our professional reputations and careers. These actions must stop immediately. If they continue, we will be forced to share the full, documented truth of your behavior with everyone in your social and professional circles. We would prefer not to take this step, but we will not allow you to damage our relationships and livelihoods through lies and manipulation. The only path forward for our relationship requires 1. A sincere apology to Amber's parents. 2. Acknowledgement of the truth about what happened at Christmas. 3. A commitment to respectful behavior going forward. 4. Immediate cessation of all attempts to damage our relationships and careers. The choice is yours. We hope you make the right one. Ryan and Amber. After sending the email, we braced ourselves for the response. It came not by reply but through Ryan's father calling him directly, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Are you threatening us? Richard demanded. No, Dad, Ryan replied calmly. I'm setting boundaries and explaining consequences. There's a difference. You wouldn't dare expose family matters publicly, Richard said, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. I don't want to, Ryan acknowledged. But I will if you force my hand. The truth is on our side. After a long pause, Richard said, I'll discuss this with your mother, and hung up. We knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, we felt we had a chance of establishing a new, healthier dynamic or at the very least, protecting ourselves from further harm. The Wilsons had underestimated us, assuming we would eventually capitulate to preserve peace or out of fear of their influence. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 2 weeks passed with no direct response from Barbara and Richard. Through Ryan's siblings, we heard they were thinking things over which, knowing them, likely meant plotting their next move rather than genuinely reflecting on their behavior. Meanwhile, the whisper campaign against us had quieted, suggesting our boundary setting had at least given them pause. Our opportunity to fully implement our plan came sooner than expected. The annual charity gala for the Children's Hospital was approaching, an event where Barbara had served on the planning committee for years and where the Wilsons made a point of being seen with the city's elite. Through Jessica, we learned they had been assuring everyone that the unfortunate family misunderstanding had been resolved and that all would be normal at the gala. They're pretending nothing happened, Jessica reported after a tense lunch with her parents. Mom's telling people you apologized and admitted overreacting. This fabrication was the final straw. Ryan and I had tickets to the gala through my network's corporate table, a fact Barbara might not have considered since we'd never attended before. We decided the public event would be the perfect setting to clarify the truth, not through a scene, but through calm, factual conversation with key individuals. The night of the gala, we arrived looking our best, me in a midnight blue gown that complemented my eyes, Ryan striking in his tuxedo. We spotted Barbara and Richard across the ballroom, holding court with several hospital board members. The momentary flash of shock on Barbara's face when she saw us was quickly masked with her practiced social smile, but we knew our presence had rattled her. Rather than confront them directly, we circulated among the guests, engaging in genuine conversations about the hospital's work. When the topic of family inevitably arose, we were honest but measured. Yes, we've been going through a challenging time with Ryan's parents, I would say when asked. Unfortunately, they treated my parents very poorly at Christmas, actually locked them outside in freezing weather and refused to let them in. We're hoping they'll apologize and we can move forward, but so far, they've chosen to spread misinformation instead. The simple truth, delivered without drama but with unwavering clarity, had a powerful effect. Several of Barbara's friends expressed shock and concern, many admitting they'd heard a very different version of events. By the time dinner was served, whispers had spread throughout the room, and Barbara and Richard sat stiffly at their table, smiles fixed but eyes darting nervously. The defining moment came when Eleanor Patterson, whose social approval Barbara coveted above all others, stopped by our table. I've heard some concerning things tonight, she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard at nearby tables. Barbara has always been so concerned with proper behavior. I find it hard to reconcile that with what I'm hearing about her treatment of your parents, Amber. Before I could respond, Ryan spoke up. My mother has struggled with insecurity about her background for many years, Mrs. Patterson. Unfortunately, that sometimes manifests as cruelty toward those who remind her of where she came from, like Amber's wonderful parents. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Her background? But she's always given the impression of old money and established family connections. My mother grew up in very modest circumstances, Ryan explained, his voice gentle but clear. Her father worked at the steel mill. There's no shame in that. My wife's parents come from similar hardworking roots, and we're proud of that heritage. It's unfortunate that my mother feels differently. The ripple effect of this revelation was immediate and visible. Across the room, Barbara's face had drained of color as she watched her carefully constructed facade crumble. Richard was speaking urgently into her ear, likely strategizing damage control, but the damage was done. The truth Barbara had spent decades concealing was now common knowledge among the very people she'd been desperate to impress. By the evening's end, Several of Richard's business associates had made a point of speaking with Ryan, assuring him that they valued his work on its own merits and that family disagreements would have no bearing on professional relationships. 2 board members approached me to express interest in featuring the Children's Hospital's work on my news segment, effectively endorsing my professional reputation. We left the gala knowing we had successfully corrected the narrative without stooping to Barbara and Richard's level of manipulation and deceit. The consequences we'd promised had been delivered. Not through threats or vindictiveness, but through simple truth. 3 days later, an email arrived from Richard, Ryan and Amber. After considerable reflection, Barbara and I recognized that our behavior at Christmas was inappropriate. We apologize for the distress caused to Kathleen and Michael, and for subsequent attempts to mischaracterize the events. Barbara struggles with issues stemming from her upbringing, but that is no excuse for how she acted. We would like to meet in person to offer a proper apology to your parents and discuss how we might repair our family relationships going forward. Richard Wilson. It wasn't a perfect apology, the passive language and vague references to behavior and distress rather than specific acknowledgement of actions betrayed a lingering reluctance to fully own their actions. But it was a start. The meeting that followed was awkward but productive. Barbara and Richard sat stiffly in our living room across from my parents, who showed remarkable grace despite everything that had happened. We behaved badly, Barbara admitted, the words clearly difficult for her. Locking you out was wrong. And the things I said afterward were inexcusable. My mother, ever compassionate, reached out to touch Barbara's hand. We all make mistakes, especially when we're feeling threatened or insecure. What matters is learning and growing from them. Barbara looked startled at this generous response, perhaps having expected recrimination rather than understanding. I've spent so many years trying to be someone else, she confessed, her carefully constructed persona cracking to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. When I see people who are comfortable with who they really are, like you and Michael, it reminds me of everything I've been running from. It wasn't an instant transformation. Barbara didn't suddenly become warm and embracing of my parents' middle-class background. Richard still occasionally made tone-deaf comments about money and status. But something fundamental had shifted. The power dynamic had been reset, with clear understanding that disrespect would have consequences. Over the following months, we established new boundaries and expectations for family gatherings. Ryan and I made clear that any return to previous behaviors would result in immediate consequences. We would leave events, cancel plans, or maintain distance as needed to protect ourselves and my parents. At Jessica's spring wedding, both families coexisted with relative harmony. Barbara made visible efforts to engage with my parents, asking my father about his teaching career with what seemed like genuine interest. Small steps, but meaningful ones. Perhaps most significant was the change in Ryan. Having stood up to his parents for the first time in his life, he discovered a newfound confidence and clarity about his own values and priorities. I spent so many years trying to keep the peace at any cost, he reflected as we drove home from the wedding. I never realized how much it was costing me, in self-respect, in authenticity, in really being present for you when you needed me. For my part, I found that standing firm in my own worth and refusing to accept disrespect had strengthened not just my marriage but my sense of self. The professional attacks Barbara and Richard had attempted had backfired, actually raising my profile and leading to new opportunities at the network. My parents, too, had grown through the experience. We've always tried to be people pleasers, my father admitted during a Sunday dinner at our home. Always worried about imposing or causing trouble. But seeing you stand up for us, Amber, it reminded us that we deserve respect too. When the next Christmas season approached, we decided to host again, but this time with clearly established expectations and boundaries. Barbara and Richard would be welcome, but only if they continued to demonstrate the respectful behavior they'd been working toward. The gathering wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, awkward pauses, and the occasional tone-deaf comment. But there was also laughter, genuine conversation, and my mother teaching Barbara how to make her famous apple pie, a small but symbolic bridging of the class divide that had once seemed insurmountable. As I watched our families interact with newfound respect, I reflected on the journey of the past year. What had begun as a horrible moment of cruelty had ultimately led to growth, healing, and the establishment of healthier relationships. By refusing to accept disrespect and standing firmly in our truth, we had created the possibility of genuine connection. The blue lips of my parents on that freezing Christmas night had been a turning point, the moment when silence and accommodation were no longer options. In making Barbara and Richard face the consequences of their actions, we hadn't just enacted revenge, we had created the possibility of something better for all of us. Family relationships are complex, imperfect things. They require work, boundaries, forgiveness, and sometimes difficult confrontations. But when built on a foundation of mutual respect and truth, they can weather even the coldest of storms. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who crossed serious boundaries? How did you handle it, and what was the outcome? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that it's okay to demand respect from family. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, protecting those you love sometimes means being brave enough to face difficult truths.